let alone a strawberry one.
Yeah.
So, hey, today we're going to be looking at the book of Deuteronomy, and what we're going to find is that Moses is talking about the law again. And so we were just kind of talking about it and just thought it'd be good to talk about why does Moses talk about the law so much? And is that important for us today, right? If we're saved by grace, what does the law really matter for us? So we'll talk about that today. And we're also excited to have a psalm from Pam Chiles. So check this out.
Our readings this week in the book of Psalm include chapter 5. Chapter 5 is a prayer that David prayed. And when I think of David, I remember that God said of him that he was a man after his own heart. And I've often wondered, how did David become that man? And I thought maybe as I read this psalm, I'll get some insight into their relationship. Near the beginning of the prayer, David acknowledges who God is. He is his king and his God. Even though David was king of Israel, he knew that God was King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And then he says to God, every morning I can come and stand before you, waiting for you to give me direction for my day. I just realized we've entered David's daily private time with God. And he says, God, every morning I want you to give me your direction. And then in verse 4, he speaks of God's holiness. He says, you are not a God who takes pleasure in wickedness, nor can evil dwell with you. And after acknowledging who God is, he switches to his burdens. I think David had had a rough night because he begins describing evil men who are trying to destroy him. He says they are wicked men, boastful, sinful, bloodthirsty liars. He's describing some of the sin that God hates. Now, he knows God's love. He experienced it. And he knows that God loves the world and the people he created. But he knows he cannot tolerate sin. He hates that. And he knew these men couldn't be in his presence. But in verse 7, with a thankful heart, David says, but as for me, I will come into your house in the multitude of your mercy. In fear of you, I will worship toward your temple. Lead me, O Lord, in your righteousness because of mine enemies. Make your way straight before my face. David knows that God won't let the guilty get away with their plans against him because of God's holiness and righteousness. In verse 9, David begins to talk to God again about these wicked men, but this time he calls for God to deal them justice, to cast them out because they've rebelled against the King of Kings. And finally, when he's trusted everything to God, his quiet time suddenly changes. He says in verse 11, but let all those rejoice who put their trust in you. With favor you will surround them with a shield. David began his daily quiet time with a heavy heart, but after spending time with God, he ends it with a joyful heart. Rejoice, shout for joy, be joyful, he says, and because we trust the Lord and love his name, ultimately he defends us from our enemies and puts a shield around us. Some insights from David in the psalm. David knew who God is, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He knew he needed to spend time with him every day. He knew that God is holy. He knew that he could take his burdens to him. And he knew that God was faithful. And because of that, he will deliver the righteous from the wicked. He knew he could shout for joy. Remember, God is faithful. And we too can shout with joy.
All right. Well, we are back in Deuteronomy, and again, we are talking about the law again. Yeah. And so we're going to look at kind of, okay, what is going on here? Why does he keep going over this again and again and again? But we have to start with, hey, these are new people, right? Yeah. Like he is talking to a generation that has not heard this. And again, they did not necessarily have the written Bible that we have, and so they passed these laws down through talking about it and sharing them over and over and over again. And he had shared it with their parents. He is now sharing it with them. But it's more than that, isn't it?
Yeah. So, I mean, and it's good, too, to remember this book as a whole, Deuteronomy, that it's kind of like Moses' send-off. We know from the book of Numbers that God tells Moses that he's not going to enter the promised land. And Deuteronomy, he's kind of passing the baton off to Joshua and this new generation. And it's kind of like, hey, his parting words, he wants to make sure that they fully understand the law that was given to their parents' generation and how it still applies to them today. And so he's just reminding them, he's telling them, hey, don't make the same mistakes as your parents did, but live in a way that's obeying these laws instead of rebelling against them. But it does kind of bring us to this idea of like the purpose of the law. Again, it's like drilled into our heads in the Pentateuch and Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, even back in Exodus, where the giving of the law, and it's repeated over and over and over again. And it does beg the question, why is this so important, and why does Moses talk about it so much? And again, it is a reminder, but is there something more to it than that, or is that it, do you think?
Yeah, I think it is that, hey, your parents have failed in this. Like, this is what God has intended for you, not that you're going to be able to keep it, because we know that they're not going to be able to, but it also is, I think, a picture of, hey, God's plan, like the life that God has for you is best lived out the way God has set it up. And that if you want a life, not that is free and easy and like everything like goes well, but a life that is what you were made and designed for, follow this, and it will lead you to where God has wanted to take you.
Yeah, and I think that if you pay attention as you read through Deuteronomy, you do see that like several different times where Moses through God, or God through Moses, I said that backwards, but where several times he reminds them like, hey, do this so that you will be prosperous in the land that you're going, so that all will be well with you and God. That it's ultimately the law, or not ultimately, but part of the purpose of the law is to protect them and to prosper them and to give them the greatest good, right? And we know from early on back in Exodus that God has this plan, that he's enacted this plan to kind of set Israel apart from the rest of the surrounding nations. And part of that is by observing and obeying the law. And so it kind of separates them, sets them apart. It's for their own good, right? And that's what we see Moses reminding them of. It's, not a whole lot different than probably what we experience with our kids, where, how many times have you told your kids the same thing over and over and over again, and they keep not listening, they keep disobeying, and it's, it's not that the law itself is what fixes the problem, but we're trying to help guide them and give them the best life possible. Yeah. And that's kind of what I think is going on here too.
Yeah, we're in the summer now. I play outside with my kids. We got a little retaining wall like a foot or two high that's by our plants and whatnot. And I say over and over again, don't play on that. Don't play on that. And it's not like, hey, you're doing something so good by not playing on it. It's for your protection, but it's also, hey, are you like listening? Are you like obeying, like the one who knows what's best for you?
Do you trust
right.
That?
And apparently they don't. So.
Yeah. Well, that's parenthood, I think. Yeah. I don't think you're alone in that.
But yeah, it's that like, hey, this is not given to say, hey, I do not want you to do what you are enjoying right now.
Yeah.
But it is, I know that you could fall, and I don't want to go to the emergency room. You won't want to go to the emergency room. Like, this is not a good thing to be doing, so it's for your good.
Yeah, so I think that's, an important thing to remember with the law, whether we're talking about the Old Testament or even our lives today, that God's word and his commands for us are meant for our best and for our good. Mm-hmm. But it does still kind of beg the question where we read throughout the New Testament that we are not saved through the law. In fact, we're told like quite the opposite, that no one can be saved through the law. Mm-hmm. And so all of this is true what we said, but if we're saved by grace and not through the law, then is the law really important for us today? And how should it affect the way that we live,
Yes. No, yeah. Honestly, I was just reading about this actually yesterday and kind of just looking at like Romans 3:19 and 20, like I think really points this out, that the law, like following the law doesn't make you good. In fact, following the law just points out that you're not good. Yeah. And kind of this idea that, hey, like that the law will reveal my need for a savior rather than making me my savior, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, I think that's good. And, the Bible is clear about the law. It's good. It's meant for our good, and we are to follow it, even though we're not saved by it, even though it reveals that sinfulness, that weakness that we have, But there's so many examples that we could point out where it's not just, oh, well, the Old Testament is about the law, and the New Testament's about grace and the gospel. And, we have to be, I think, careful that we don't divorce those two things and separate them like they're not related. Now, again, totally 100% saved by grace alone, through faith alone. But Jesus is pretty clear that if we are following him and we truly have faith in him, then it will show in our actions and we will live a certain way.
Yeah. Well, even his words, he came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. So,
yeah, and we see whenever he preaches the Sermon on the Mount, right? He doesn't say, "Oh, don't worry about the law." In fact, he raises the bar. He says, "Hey, it's not just about committing adultery, but are you looking lustfully at someone? And if you've done that, you've committed adultery in your heart." And so he doesn't diminish the law, but he raises the bar. And so I think the same thing's true for us today. We see lots of, John 14:15, Jesus says, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." In James, we read kind of a well-known passage about how faith and works are not opposed to each other, but that they work together, that our faith is seen through our works. And so, right, our obedience to God's law shows our love for and our faith in Jesus. They're not opposed, but they work together in a way that I think is important for us today, that we can't just discard the law because, Jesus came and so now it doesn't apply to us.
Yeah, and I think that the principle we see throughout Deuteronomy holds true today. And there's a fine line between if I do good, God does good things for me, but there's a blessing for following the law,
right?
And there's a curse for not. Yeah. And again, not that I follow so I don't get cursed, but it's also there's natural things with my kids walking on the wall, right? If they fall off, they did not listen. There's a punishment that happens maybe naturally or just because you did not listen. But if you listen, good things should happen. You don't go to the emergency room. We get to play in the sprinkler, whatever. So
I think the law, again, if we look at Deuteronomy and we kind of wrap up the Pentateuch, that we're talking a lot more about it. But again, it's important, obviously, to Moses, to the Israelites, and to us today that we understand God's purpose in the law, that it's good, that it's for our betterment, and that ultimately it does still apply to us today. We do still need to see how we can live by God's commands and see how it impacts our lives.
Yeah, which we'll see that when we get into Luke. What does actually living like a disciple of Jesus, someone who follows what he says, what does that look like? So.
All right, so that brings us to the book of Luke in the New Testament, and we will pass over the Beatitudes for now. We're going to talk more about that when we read the book of Matthew. But kind of to go along with what we were just talking about, as we see in the book of Luke, that Jesus connects, again, following him, being his disciple, with producing fruit. We'll say that's how he says it, right? And basically he's connecting obedience with faith, right? That they're connected. He talks about how if we're really following him, how our lives will bear good fruit, that something will be produced in our lives that shows that we're his followers, right? He talks about bearing good fruit. He talks about building our house on the rock, and he says, the one who obeys me is like the one who builds his house on a rock. And so we see, again, that there's this correlation between faith and obedience, that we can't pull them apart, that we're saved by faith and faith alone, but that if we have true faith, it will result in the way we live our lives.
Yeah, I mean, you have the parable of the sower as well. It's the same deal of the seeds falling on the multiple types of ground, and based on how it takes that, what will happen? Will it bear fruit? But I think, and just besides the fact that these are all reminded me of children's songs, but again, those are things that, hey, you're using that to teach, right?
Yeah.
You're using that to teach obedience. And it is kind of that, okay, here, this is what that looks like. And then we kind of move ahead to, okay, he sends his followers out. Okay, this is what I'm sending you to go do.
Yeah.
And will you do that?
Right, yeah, it's the obedience to his commands, and then it's, hey, sending them out to go and tell other people, to preach and to heal and to serve others, right? And we see that God has this plan where he wants more and more people to know him, to worship him, to have a relationship with him. And his plan to accomplish that is his people. It's his followers. And we know that same reality exists for us today. That's why we talk about the Great Commission often, because that's the last thing that Jesus said to his disciples before he ascended, was to go and make disciples of all nations, right? And so that charge still exists for us today, just like he sent out the 12 and the 72 in Luke. We're sent out today as his disciples to bring his message to the world.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too that he goes from sending out the 12 to where I think if you're kind of like just like skeptical or looking for a way out, you can say, well, those are the 12 disciples. Like he sent them out. That's what they did, because they were super Christians or something. But like, no, then he sent everybody else. And then the charge to anybody who was there before he ascends into heaven, hey, go and do this.
Yeah, and I think, that can be a common maybe misunderstanding or mistake that we can make when we read passages like this. Oh, well, that applied to them, but it doesn't apply to us today. Yeah. And again, not everything that's in the Bible is fully universal and applies to us today. But when we read the New Testament, most of the time it is. Most of the time, that message that they're receiving is a message that's important for us today to follow and to obey. And so, again, our lives should be a pattern of, or should follow the pattern we see here set out by Jesus, that, again, in America, in churches, we can often gather together and we can soak up and learn more and study our Bibles and read. And of course, we should do all of those things. But the danger can be whenever we only do that, when we only take in and consume, but we never actually take what we've learned, apply it to our lives, and share it with others.
Right. It's that just a step of obedience of like, hey, I've heard this, now what am I going to do with that? And yeah, there's an interesting thing too that like we see in chapter 9 is where he sends out his followers. He sends out the 12. Then in chapter 10 we have the 72 are sent out. But in between that is this almost kind of a, wow, it's not exactly the best sales pitch for sending to just let people out. Like, here's what it's going to cost to follow me. And spoiler, it's a lot.
Yeah, right. It's kind of ironic, because I think we talked about this maybe in Mark too, but it's like kind of, it's right after Jesus says like to his disciples, like, hey, who do you say I am? And Peter's like, oh, you're the Messiah. And it's like, if you're reading like, oh, they finally get it and they understand, like, this is such a cool moment. And then Jesus' response is like, okay, well, if you want to follow after me, take up your cross, deny yourself, basically this call to come and to die to yourself and to be willing to give up everything, right? It's not a seeker-sensitive call to the masses. It's, hey, if you really want to follow me, it's going to cost you a lot, and here's what it really means.
Yeah. Yeah, so he gives them, like, hey, this is what it's going to cost, and then he sends out more. Right. Yeah. And then we kind of get to this thought of like, okay, these people are going and doing what he says. Yeah. Like, so they're responding well, but like he also kind of has some fickle like relationships with the crowds. Yeah. That we can see throughout some of these just like stories here of like, again, not like he loves them, then he doesn't, but there is some different responses that kind of share with us a little bit of that.
Yeah. And again, of course, like I think fickle is maybe, of Jesus is perfect, so like he's not. But like
it's a
when
human
we
word,
read it, like it's like, well, why is he acting this way in this situation and a different way in another situation? But like we see that again, he's building this following. He's got his disciples of 72, but it also seems like there's large crowds that are like almost stalking him, following him around. And he's healing the sick. He's performing all these miracles, and we see that. In those situations, he does have compassion for them. We see him continuing to heal people. We see him feeding the 5,000, right? Where, in one of the gospel accounts, it says that he looks out on the crowds and he has compassion, that he loves them and he wants to help them.
You see his words there even too, like with his like disciples who are like, well, send him away to go get food. He's like, no, you feed him. Like, hey, like let's help them.
Yeah. And so he has this like clear sense of love and compassion for all people. But he also does things that, don't seem like they're very they're not crowd pleasers.
Yeah.
They're not things that you would expect someone who's trying to gather this mass audience to do, right? He talks about being willing to die, to deny yourself, to take up your cross. He says if you don't hate your father or mother, brother or sister. He talks about bringing division in families, right? He even like speaks about this. He kind of judges the crowd. He says, hey, you guys are looking for a sign. Mm-hmm. He says like he calls them an evil generation in Luke 11, right? And so he's offering all these words. He speaks in parables, right, that a lot of people don't understand. And so he's doing all of these things, and I guess maybe the question is like, why do you think, why would he be doing these things, and what do we take away from it?
I think you hit it on the head, though, like when you said he's not a crowd pleaser. Like his role and what he's wanting to do is not to make people feel good and to do like the absolute most. Like, and I think in the church as a whole, like at times, especially like the Western church, we almost want to lower the bar to let more
people,
yeah. And Jesus is basically saying, I'm not going to lower the bar. Like right. I'm keeping the bar where it's at. And there's maybe some like frustration, like some righteous, just like frustration because he's not in sin, but like of, hey, you don't get this, like, and it's knowing that he has what's best for him, knowing that he's leading them in that way, knowing that, hey, if you just obey me, if you do what I've asked you to do, this will be better for you. Yeah. And there's that like frustration side, but I think like his like feeling is love, but like love kind of takes those
sometimes
terms
love, I mean,
it's a corrective,
us,
yeah. And I think that we can kind of look at like, well, he's mad at him, like, but hey, have you ever had like someone that's like loves you enough to kind of be upset? Like we say, this is not what you should be doing. Mm-hmm. This is not what your life should be about. And if you've made that change, you look back and you're thankful. Yeah. But if you didn't, you look back and you're like, I did not like that person.
Yeah, no, and I think that's exactly that. I think Jesus just knows that he has all these people following him who aren't really serious about following him. They are just seeking him for what he can give them or do for them. And he's not, he loves all people and he wants all people to follow him, but he's being very clear that like, hey, if you want to follow me, here's the standard. Here's what it's really going to take. He talks about counting the cost. Mm-hmm. He says, what king before he goes out to battle doesn't count his troops and count the enemy. It's this part of following Jesus does require us to consider the cost and to say, hey, am I invested and all in, or am I only in it for the good things that Jesus can bring to my life, but I don't want to sacrifice anything? And I think Jesus is God, and he sees that, and he knows that's happening among these crowds. Mm-hmm. And so he's trying to draw them out of that into something deeper and better, like you said.
Yeah. Well, it may be a judgment on the church now as a whole of like, we don't quite grasp like counting the cost a little bit because the church in America, we're soft.
Yeah, and it doesn't cost us hardly anything at all.
Yeah, but like you've been in these places where we go to Africa and like India and stuff, where you talk to believers who are like, there's people who had to like make that choice of, this is going to cost me a lot.
Right.
And like, we don't have to make that choice. Like we say thankfully, but maybe not. I don't know. Like,
yeah. And I think it's it'd be a good discussion for another time, but yeah, how do we live sacrificially and live in a way that we're, counting the cost? Because it's not going to look the same as it is for the Muslim background believer who has to leave behind their whole family and everything they own to follow Jesus, or people who are persecuted and even are martyred for their faith. Obviously, it's not going to be the same for us, but there does have to be something, right, that where we are counting the cost and we are making sacrifices and we are living differently than the rest of our society. And again, discussion for maybe another time, but we see Jesus here again just calling them into this deeper relationship with him.
And so we move into probably one of the most misunderstood, maybe not misunderstood, but just what the heck is going on here?
It's weird.
Things of like the transfiguration, right? It's something that like we've probably heard the word, but if anyone is honest, like we don't know what it means, right?
Yeah, and honestly, we were talking about like I don't even know that we had a great grasp on this story before we really read about it and studied it this week. It's a weird story. Jesus goes up with his kind of inner circle, Peter, James, and John. They get up to the top of the mountain, and all of a sudden, like Moses and Elijah appear, and they're like talking with Jesus, and it's really bright, and the disciples can't hear what's going on. And then Peter walks up, and he's like trying to like be a good host and build tents for them to stay in. And then all of a sudden, Moses and Elijah disappear, and Jesus is like super shiny.
Yeah.
All his clothes are really shiny. And then there's like the booming voice from heaven where God says, this is my son in whom I'm well pleased. And then that's it. And then they walk down the mountain, and it's like,
and Jesus says, "Hey, don't tell anyone about this."
It's like what just happened?
Yeah.
What's going on here? And so what were some of the things that you, I guess, learned this week that as you thought about it, read about it?
Yeah, I think that like the big thing is that, hey, it is something that happened, but it's a symbol as well of it's a picture of God is Jesus, right? It is, hey, let's leave no doubt. Like we've had times where like Peter like confesses him, and like we have that as evidence, but this is kind of, hey, he's bringing three guys that are close to him, and there's no doubt. And you have Elijah, and you have like Moses, and like you had a great thing that you pointed out. And I don't know if it's original with
No,
you
it
or
was
something.
not.
You just,
It
like,
was
saw
not
with somebody
original,
else,
not
but
original.
a great thought about like what that represented.
Yeah, I mean, when you read the Bible and then even the New Testament, it talks about, Jesus will talk about the law and the prophets. Those are kind of the two big components of the Old Testament. And the law is represented by Moses, as we've been reading a lot about that. And then the prophets, kind of maybe the most major prophet in all of the Old Testament is Elijah. And so the thing I was reading just said, hey, Moses and Elijah kind of represent the law and the prophets, what was happening and what existed in the Old Testament. And then you have Jesus, who now represents something new and different and more complete even. And how at the end of this encounter, Moses and Elijah disappear.
Right.
Basically, they're gone, and you're left with Jesus as kind of this fulfillment of the law and the prophet and what he would one day do, obviously, on the cross. And so just, again, a lot of symbolism going on here. And we even see a little bit, right? There's a parallel with a story from the Old Testament, right? You were talking about that with Moses, right?
Yeah, you have like Moses is reflecting like the glory of God there, and like of course he's been in the presence of God like before, but it's a reflection. It's not like coming from him. But then we see with Jesus, it's very clear he's not like reflecting. Why? Because he is that, right? And it's so like the light is coming from him.
Yeah. So like with Moses, he comes down from the mountain and he's reflecting God's glory off of his face and stuff. But with Jesus, it's like this inward thing that is coming from within him and shining out. And so it's just kind of cool to see the connections there with the Old Testament. And again, a lot of symbolism. But we see ultimately, again, this is just a clear sign to those three disciples that like, hey, they knew he was the Messiah, but like they're, I think, more and more understanding the gravity of what that means and who he really is. And obviously they'll understand it in an even clearer way once Jesus' death and resurrection have passed.
Yep. All right, well, that about wraps us up for this week. But before we wrap it up, we want to have a little bit of fun. We've given you a glimpse into the lives of some staff members over the past few weeks we've been doing this. We've spent some time with Cass and Jeff Russum. Today, we're going to spend one good minute with one of my favorite people on staff, Mr. Ken Long.
Okay, I'm Ken Long, maintenance custodial supervisor at the church. Peanut butter and bologna. The lake. We always go to the lake, Lake Norfolk. Walter Brimley? Wilford Brimley, yeah, that guy. Lonesome Dove.
Is it a movie or miniseries?
Well, it's a mini-series. Broken Trail, that's a good one. Yeah, I helped restore carousel horses at one time. That was enjoyable. Nothing. I don't need anything weird. Oh my word. It's a terrible thing to even ask.
Well, thank you, Ken. That was 1 good minute, and I think we could all agree that we could have used maybe 10 good minutes. But fun fact about Ken, he is a musician, although he may not appear like one, plays the dulcimer. And I don't even know what that is exactly, but you should look it up and check it out sometime.
Yeah, I think it's a harp. He also has the voice of an angel as well, so ask him to sing for you sometime. All right, we're continuing our reading for next week. We are finishing up Deuteronomy and continuing in Luke, and we'll also throw in the book of Joshua as well. And so join us for that. And it's been a good week.
Yeah, thanks for joining us for the Friday Lunchbox, and we'll see you next week.
Remember, Jeff Russell likes to party.